at 12 o'clock at night. Of course, my friend couldn't resist, but he had to ask, "Well, mother, did you meet the devil?" And of course he expected that his mother would laugh or smile, but much to his surprise, she did neither. And in fact, she looked at him in a very serious way for a couple of moments, and then she replied, "Son, I did not meet the devil that night, but shortly after that, I met your father." Oh dear, it just gets worse as the day goes on. I was telling this story recently to a group of Austrian people. I had a tour, a private tour of Austrians, and they were good fun. And having told this story, one of them decided to tell me his own graveyard story, and I thought it was quite amusing. But if you don't like it, you can blame the Austrian guy, don't blame me. And the story goes that, I'm sure we're all familiar with the name Mozart. Mozart, the great Austrian composer. Mozart, before his death, he was internationally renowned as a great composer of classical music. When he died, he was buried in a small country graveyard, a simple small country graveyard, at his own request. Afterwards, local people noticed something very, very unusual. Every evening after darkness, they could hear very strange music coming from the grave of Mozart. After a while, they realized that this, in fact, was Mozart's music being played backwards. They decided they would go to the local clergyman and they would discuss this matter with him. So they went to the local clergyman and they explained, every evening after darkness, we can hear Mozart's music being played backwards, coming from his grave. The clergyman simply laughed and he said, "Oh, don't worry about that. Don't worry at all. That's just Mozart decomposing." Oh dear. Oh dear, I did tell you it gets worse as the day goes on. Again, I was telling a story one day to a group of Americans, and there was a guy at the back who was, you might call him a bit of a heckler, in a nice way, not in a bad way. Easygoing sort of a guy, but he was good at heckling. And when I told that little story, I could hear him shouting, "Jim, stick to the day job." People are so cruel, that's all I can say. Anyway, there you are, enough of that nonsense. And we'll move on. I'm going to go back to our friends, the Vikings. And I mentioned how the Vikings settled here, and they built the very first ports, important ports, organised ports in Ireland. But when they decided they were going to stay, naturally the Irish resented them. And there was much warfare between the Vikings and the Irish. It was not until the year 1014, exactly 1,000 years ago this year, that our most famous High King, our most famous overall king, a man called Brian Boru. He decisively defeated the Vikings at the Battle of Clontarf. Clontarf is just outside the city of Dublin. It's now a suburb of modern-day Dublin. After the great Battle of Clontarf, in which Brian Boru himself was killed, the power of the Vikings in Ireland was broken. They were no longer a military threat to the Irish. And in time, if they had not already done so, the Vikings converted to Christianity. They also adopted Irish customs, and they intermarried with the Irish. And so, again in time, they became Irish themselves. Now, the next people to come to Ireland of significance were the Normans. And the Normans, like the Romans so many centuries before them, were the all-conquering professional army. They conquered much of Europe. They also conquered much of Britain. And eventually they invaded Ireland in the year 1169. Oh, excuse me. And they quickly conquered much of the south and the east of Ireland. In areas that they conquered, initially they built what we call motte and bailey castles. These in fact were wooden forts placed on man-made mounds or small hills. They would create a mound or a small hill, and they would place their wooden structure on top, surrounded by a wooden defense. However, they soon found that these wooden structures were not strong enough to deter attacks from the Irish. And I'm going to show you the remains of one of those wooden. The wooden structure obviously is gone, and if you look to your left, you will see a small mound here. The Normans would have created that, and they would have placed their wooden structure on top. The stone fort that you see now dates from a different period, and as I say, these two mounds here would have been surrounded by a wooden defense. However, as I said, the Normans soon found that this was not enough to deter attacks from the Irish, and so they began building their strong stone castles. And we're going to see an example of this shortly. While there are many of these old Norman castles in Ireland, unfortunately, due to centuries of warfare and neglect, many of these castles have now fallen into ruin. But in some cases they are substantial ruins. So let us go and see this one here in Dundrum. And I mentioned that after the Vikings we had the Normans. The Normans came originally from Normandy in the north of France, and they were in fact direct descendants of the Vikings who had settled in Normandy. And after the Norman invasion of Ireland, at a later stage came the English. And the English, more so than anyone else, had a huge influence on our society. We were totally dominated by the English for several centuries. And there would, of course, be a long and a sad history between the Irish and the English. However, having said that, you may be surprised to know that the English never invaded Ireland. It was not the English who invaded Ireland, but the Normans. And the Normans in England and in Ireland evolved to become English. And so, quite literally, the English took up where the Normans left off. Now, later I'm going to talk about the origins. After we leave Dundrum here, I want to talk about the origins of the problems in Northern Ireland. If you look to your left, by the way, you're looking east, out towards the Irish Sea. And away off in the distance is Scotland. I will be talking about the origins of the problems in Northern Ireland, and in order to do so, we have to go back, quite literally, to the time of the Normans. And while there were many differences between the Irish and the Normans, culturally, militarily, and so on, there were no significant religious differences. That was because the Normans, like the Irish, were Catholic, and so there were no major differences between them. It was not until the time of Henry VIII. Henry VIII came to power in England in the early 1500s, and at that time much of Ireland, but not all of it, was under English control. I'm going to come back to that after we have paid a visit to the old Norman castle here. And to make the point that the Normans usually built their castles strategically on high vantage points, in some cases overlooking cities and towns, but in others overlooking the harbour, as is the case here, and affording protection to their fishing fleet. And being on high ground would have given them commanding views of the surrounding countryside. This particular castle was destroyed by Oliver Cromwell's forces in the mid-1600s, and I will talk in more detail about that man, Oliver Cromwell, at a later stage. The castle now lies in ruin, and afterwards a local family who came into the possession of the land surrounding it, they built a mansion. A mansion in the grounds of the castle, but as you can see, it too now lies in ruin.